affect the outcome.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I have been consistently voting against cloture motions to proceed to debate on judicial nominations, and I would like to take this opportunity to explain why. The Senate has a constitutional obligation to provide advice and consent on judicial nominees, and I take this obligation very seriously. The American people depend on the Senate to fully consider and vet each judicial nominee because throughout the course of their lifetime appointment, judges will issue rulings and opinions that touch each of our lives. The process of nominating, considering, and confirming judges should be a deliberate one. Its purpose should not be to confirm as many judges as quickly as possible. Senators should be able to provide input on who should sit on the federal bench. Senators should have an adequate opportunity to hear from third-party experts about the records and qualifications of each nominee. And senators should have enough time to question and examine a nominee during a confirmation hearing. Insisting on a deliberate and comprehensive process is not, as some of my Republican colleagues might argue, an effort to deny the president his prerogative to nominate judges to lifetime appointments to the federal bench. Instead, this process is essential in determining whether each nominee we consider is qualified for the job and can separate their personal ideology from the decisions he or she renders. For a lifetime appointment to the federal bench, this shouldn't be too much to ask. Over the past year, we've observed a number of concerning issues in the nomination and confirmation process for federal judges that need to be corrected. The president has essentially outsourced the judicial selection process to two organizations with strong, ideologically driven agendas: the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. The Federalist Society, for example, describes itself, quote, as a group of libertarians and conservatives dedicated to reforming the legal order, end quote. This is a group that has supported legal efforts to undermine environmental protection, erode the constitutional right to choose, and blur the lines between church and state. The Heritage Foundation describes its mission as one to, quote, promote conservative public policies, end quote. Over the past few years alone, this organization, this group, has fought to undermine the Affordable Care Act, oppose LGBTQ rights, and erode the ability of federal agencies to issue life-saving regulations. It is not unreasonable to assume that these organizations, through their close association with the White House, expect their ideologically driven agendas to be reflected in the nominees they recommend. And while I concur with Justice Rehnquist's assertion that no judge joins a court tabula rasa or as a blank slate, we should have a baseline expectation that lifetime appointees should be able to render justice free from their own personal ideologies. At the same time as the Trump administration relies more heavily on the Federalist Society and Heritage Foundation to select its judicial nominees, it is devaluing the work done by the American Bar Association. The ABA has reviewed and vetted judicial nominees in a nonpartisan manner for over 60 years. With the exception of George W. Bush and now Donald Trump, presidents in both parties have consulted with the ABA prior to officially nominating to the bench. President Obama, for example, provided a great demonstration for how this process should work. Working closely with the ABA, President Obama routinely submitted potential candidates for scrutiny prior to their formal nomination. After conducting their independent, nonpartisan reviews, the ABA issued not qualified ratings for 14 candidates that had been proposed by President Obama. So President Obama followed the ABA's recommendation and did not formally nominate any candidates rated not qualified. Under President Trump, on the other hand, we no longer wait for the ABA to complete its assessment of nominees prior to the nomination hearing itself, much less before the nomination. We no longer have an opportunity to review the ABA's report, and in many cases do not have the chance to question an ABA representative at a nomination hearing about its review of the nominee. We've seen the serious consequences of this change in practice in 2 high-profile nominations this year. Despite never having tried a case, President Trump nominated Brett Talley to serve on the District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. Mr. Talley was nominated, given a hearing, and listed for a Judiciary Committee vote before the ABA could even finish its evaluation. Given his complete lack of qualifications for the job, it wasn't surprising that the ABA unanimously rated him not qualified. Because he was rushed through the nomination process, we only learned later that Mr. Talley failed to disclose that his wife works in the White House counsel's office. After 2 Republicans on the committee, Senator Grassley and Senator Kennedy, expressed their opposition to Mr. Talley, he fortunately withdrew from consideration. We were not so lucky with Stephen Gratz, who was recently confirmed to the 8th Circuit. Mr. Gratz was nominated and scheduled for a Judiciary Committee hearing before the ABA could complete its review. By the time the ABA finished its exhaustive evaluation, during which it found him to be not qualified, Mr. Gratz was scheduled to appear before the Judiciary Committee in less than 48 hours. This was not nearly enough time to adequately address and assess the ABA's conclusion that Mr. Gratz would not be able to serve as a judge without the undue influence of his personal beliefs. Courts are supposed to protect the rights of minorities, and it is troubling to reflect on the ABA's conclusion that Mr. Gratz would be unable to divorce his position on issues like reproductive and LGBTQ rights from the cases he will hear on the 8th Circuit. Circuit Court judges are only one step away from the United States Supreme Court and deserve to be scrutinized closely in the Judiciary Committee. Unfortunately, last year, the Judiciary Committee overrode the objections of the minority to hold 4 nomination hearings with more than 1 circuit judge nominee considered simultaneously. To put this in some historical context, the Judiciary Committee held 4 such hearings in the entire 8 years of Barack Obama as president. And it held each of these hearings with the consent of the Republican minority on the committee. During hearings on circuit and district court nominees, each committee member generally has only 5 minutes to question nominees, many of whom are highly controversial and deserve maximum scrutiny. 5 minutes, which includes the time the nominee takes to respond, is not nearly enough time to engage in meaningful dialogue about a nominee's judicial philosophy or to examine controversial cases a nominee may have decided in the past. The American people deserve much more as we consider lifetime appointments to the federal bench. I am also concerned about the erosion of the blue slip process, which has traditionally been a collaborative mechanism to enable senators to confer with the White House on nominees from their states. Although there have been exceptions over the years, presidents and Senate majorities of both parties have respected the blue slip process. In 2009, when Democrats controlled the White House and had filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, every Senate Republican signed a letter to President Obama urging him to respect the blue slip process. I'd like to read a passage from that letter for emphasis. Quote, "Regrettably, if we are not consulted on and approve of a nominee from our states, the Republican conference will be unable to support moving forward on that nominee. Despite press reports that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee now may be considering changing the committee's practice of observing senatorial courtesy, we as a conference expect it to be observed even-handedly and regardless of party affiliation. And we will act to preserve this principle and the rights of our colleagues if it is not. Because of the profound impact that life-tenured federal judges can have in our society, the founders made their appointments a shared constitutional responsibility. End quote. This is the Republican conference asking the Democratic majority and the Democratic president and the chair of the Judiciary Committee to observe the blue slip process. President Obama and the Democratic majority at the time upheld the blue slip process without exception. Last year, the Judiciary Committee held a nomination hearing for David Strauss to serve on the 8th Circuit despite his not receiving 2 positive blue slips from his home state senators. This is the first time since the early years of the George W. Bush administration that the Judiciary Committee has held a hearing for a nominee when a home state senator did not return a blue slip. If the Senate proceeds to vote on and confirm Mr. Strauss, it will be the first time since 1989 and only the 3rd time in the last 100 years that a judicial nominee was confirmed without 2 positive blue slips. I certainly take the chairman at his word that this was a one-time exception to the blue slip process, but I will hold him and the president to the same standard that they demanded from President Obama in 2009. I will continue to rigorously defend the Senate's constitutional obligation to provide advice and consent on lifetime appointees to the federal bench. And until we return to our normal process through which we can provide this kind of advice and consent, I will continue to oppose invoking cloture on any judicial nominee, and I encourage my colleagues to join me in this position. I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, every week I try to come down on the floor and talk a little bit about my state, do a little bit of bragging in what we call our Alaskan of the Week series. Now,